Welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. Today we are honored to welcome retired Brigadier General Dr. Thomas Kolditz to the Business Talk podcast, a distinguished leader and renowned expert in crisis leadership and leader development. Dr. Thomas is a social psychologist and leadership expert who has spent over 35 years developing leaders across military, academic, and corporate environments. A retired Army Brigadier General, he founded the renowned Ann John Doerr Institute for New Leaders at Rice University and previously led the Leadership Development Program at Yale School of Management. Today, he runs Saxon Castle LLC, a leadership coaching and development consultancy. Dr. Thomas is best known for developing In Extremis Leadership, a groundbreaking crisis leadership model he created while serving in Iraq. His book on this framework, In Extremis Leadership, Leading as If Your Life Depended on It, is now used to train leaders across 8 service academies globally, plus leaders in hospitals, investment banks, and other high-tech organizations. His second book, Leadership Reckoning, Can Higher Education Develop the Leaders We Need? Spark a national conversation about improving leader development in higher education. Recently named a coaching legend by Thinkers 50 in 2025, Dr. Kolditz has also earned a Warren Bennis Award for Excellence in Leadership, the Army's Distinguished Service Medal, and Fellowship in the American Psychological Association. He is an in-demand keynote speaker who has delivered leadership talks to more than 350 audiences worldwide, offering actionable insights and a grounded, pragmatic approach informed by a wealth of first-hand experience, both truths and setbacks. Dr. Thomas holds a bachelor's in psychology and sociology from Vanderbilt University, 3 master's degree, and a PhD in psychology from the University of Missouri. In this episode, he discusses key lessons from his acclaimed book, In Extremis Leadership, Leading as If Your Life Depended on It. It's my pleasure to now welcome Dr. Thomas Kolditz to the conversation. Dr. Thomas, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
Well, thank you. I feel honored to be here as well.
Dr. Thomas, how do you define in extremis leadership and what sets it apart from other crisis or high stakes leadership styles?
Yeah. In extremis leadership is when followers believe that leader behavior will influence their physical well being or survival. And the reason I began studying it was that I knew that graduates from our military academy at West Point, where I was working, were going to be going to Iraq or Afghanistan and leading other people's children. Uh, and I wanted them to, know a lot about how to lead in those contexts. But what I found out was that the application of it spread to a lot of different industries and circumstances. And one of the reasons why it's different than other forms of leadership that we see is that when people are afraid for their lives or for their livelihoods, for serious economic threats, um, management policies no longer matter. They will they will do whatever they have to do to survive. And so what you get in extremis leadership is pure leadership. No management policies. It's the pure influence of a person to others. And one of the characteristics of dangerous circumstances is uncertainty. You don't know, you don't have all the information you need to make decisions. And so in those circumstances, it's all about trust. And that's from leadership. That's not from management. So that's what it is. That's how it's different.
Dr. Thomas, your research highlights 4 core requisites for effective in extremis leaders. Could you elaborate on this and explain why they are so critical in life or death scenarios?
Um, Well, are a number of things that are characteristic of it. The first is something called inherent motivation. And what I found doing research is that people who lead in ordinary circumstances often have to motivate their followers. But when followers are afraid for their lives, they do not need motivation. And that's what the research found was that they were not interested in being motivated. They were interested in being informed, and they were interested in feeling that the leaders were taking care of them. But the motivation was inherent to the circumstances they were at. Secondly, I found that people who lead in dangerous places have an outward or learning orientation. They're not thinking about themselves, they're not experiencing their own emotions. They have an outward focus. And that's what allows them to be relatively calm and effective, even when there are life threatening circumstances. Because when you face outward, you're using a different part of your brain, your frontal cortex, as opposed to your amygdala, which is where emotions and anger and fear are. Third, shared risk is extremely important. And so leaders have to be willing to show their followers that they too are at risk and that their focus is important to them as well. And then lastly, we found that in extremis leaders benefit from having a common lifestyle with the people that they're leading. Often leaders in normal circumstances set themselves apart. They have bigger offices, they have drivers with cars, they have, things that make them different. But when people are afraid, they want to connect with a leader who understands them and their lives. So I tell my coaching clients that are in circumstances like that, that when there's an emergency and their people are working at 2 o'clock in the morning, they need to show up there, maybe with pizzas and wearing blue jeans and a sweatshirt so that they feel connected with those people that are fearful. So those are some of the characteristics of in extremis leaders that I found were pretty important when we did the research.
Dr. Thomas, in your experience at West Point and through military service, what are some of the most vivid moments that revealed the true qualities of an in extremis leader?
Well, since you mentioned West Point, I'll give you a strong example, and it comes from me. I was asked by the superintendent of West Point to be a leader for the West Point parachute team because they had gotten in trouble. Honestly, what they had done is that 8 of them had made a naked skydive at a public drop zone. And so they were in trouble, and he wanted me to work with them. And I wound up working with them for 11 years. And when you're working with people who are in dangerous contexts, an in extremis leader has to be there as well. I made 1,383 parachute jumps with them. They added my free fall time, and it was 16 hours, 31 minutes, and 20 seconds in free fall. That allowed me to have influence over them. If I had tried to influence them, but I was never jumping out of airplanes with them, they would have had no respect for me. And so in extremis leaders have to be willing to take on shared risk, the same challenges of the people that they're leading. And to me, that taught me a lot over the course of 11 years of working with 19 and 20-year-olds that were making those jumps, and most of them were out of helicopters. For many years, I had a record in our military of the number of helicopter parachute jumps. I had 647 helicopter parachute jumps. And by doing that, it gave me the credibility with that team to help shape it into a better team.
Thomas, how do in extremis leaders build trust and loyalty among followers, especially when both leader and team share the same physical risk?
Yeah. So we found that there were two sets of qualities that allowed leaders in dangerous contexts to build trust. The first and the most important was competence. That's what people were looking at in their leaders, thinking, do they have the competence to get us through this challenge? However, competence was not quite enough. The second characteristic was that they showed loyalty and concern to the followers. Because a leader can be very competent, but still not be that supportive of the people who are following them. And so the leaders had to show competence and they had to show loyalty and caring for the people that they were leading. And that created trust. And, one of the things that was very interesting about that is that we checked on many other qualities of leaders that were not nearly as important as it turned out. Things like personal integrity, that was sixth out of 10. Honesty, not that important. Uh, Physical fitness, not important. Courage was not important. And we were measuring this from soldiers who were in combat in Mosul, in Iraq. And, what we found with courage was that they would be afraid that if a leader was showing courage, that they might risk too much. They might create too much risk and put their followers in a position where more of them would get killed than necessary. But if those leaders showed competence and then they showed a concern for their people, that was enough. That was plenty to create trust. And those soldiers would then go into combat with their lives at risk, trusting those leaders. Competence and loyalty downward. That's what it takes.
Dr. Thomas, what are the main lessons from in extremis leadership that business leaders and executives can apply immediately, even if they are not operating in dangerous contexts?
Yeah. Well, a couple things. Um, Leaders need to understand how to show competence and humility at the same time, because people don't trust leaders who are not humble, narcissistic leaders who are arrogant. But at the same time, remember I said that competence was very, very important. So when I'm talking to my coaching clients about how to show their own competence, I tell them, never try to create a false impression of your competence. You'll be discovered, especially by soldiers, because they can see right through that. But what you should do is you should let people watch you lead. Bring them with you during the day. Let them see you make decisions. Let them see how you analyze problems. Because most leaders are in their positions because they are competent. But if they do all their decision making inside closed offices and they don't let people see how they work, There's no justification for people to assume that they're competent. But if they follow their leaders around, if they see what their leaders are doing, and if leaders invite them to do that, the competence comes out. The competence becomes understood, and uh, it's a good way to earn their trust and loyalty. And the second thing that I think is very important for business leaders, very important, is that they understand that one of the things that destroys trust is excessive self-interest. And the reason is that if you look at dictionary definitions and you look up what excessive self-interest means, it's cowardice. So when people act cowardly, it's always because of excessive self-interest. They run away because of excessive self-interest. They cheat or do things that are incorrect because of excessive self-interest. And if there's one characteristic that I have seen in business far too much, it's the belief that self-interest isn't limited, that business people should be extremely self-interested. And that is not good for leadership because it's cowardice. And I've done many public speeches, almost 400, and a lot of times people want to talk about courage. Oh, leaders should be courageous, and that's a popular thing to be talked about in leadership. But the challenge is not that there's a need for courage. The challenge is there's a need for not being cowardly. And that's different. And one of the things that I talk to my clients about when we're talking about cowardice is that they need to understand that all of us can commit cowardly acts. That doesn't mean we are cowards. Everyone can show excessive self-interest. Everyone can do that. And so we need to look at it as behaviors, not as a type of person, a coward as a person. It's a type of behaviors. And when we see that behavior in business, we need to stop it. And people used to ask me who I would promote. If I was surrounded by good people, how would I know who to promote? And it was always the people who were not just interested in themselves, but were helping all the people around them in the organization, sharing good ideas, doing things that bring everyone up. And there were many people who were very selfish and focused on themselves who would tell me, well, look, my team here is one of the best teams everywhere. I'd be like, yeah, but you're not sharing any ideas with anyone else. You're just letting yourself get better. And they would be shocked that they weren't promoted. They wouldn't understand how they could do so well themselves and not be promoted. And the reason was they were not helping the whole organization. So those are the things that if I were talking to business people in general, I'd talk about.
Dr. Thomas, the book discusses the importance of real world and high consequences experience. How can organizations foster genuine experiential learning for leader development outside of classroom settings?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think helps a lot is doing coaching and leader development early, not just with CEOs. There is what I have referred to in writings as a time value of leader development. So if you develop a young person and you create conditions in them where they understand more about leadership and they try that and they're successful at it and they get better at it, that will continue to develop for 40 years. It's just like investing money early. There's a time value to that. But, often we work with CEOs and executives who are only going to be there 5 or 6 years. And they're already, 50 or 60 years old, meaning they have had 40 years to learn bad habits and to make them a part of how they behave. Um, and so I think it's important to start early. I think it's also important to understand that leadership education is not leader development. There's a difference between learning academically about leadership and becoming a leader yourself. And what the universities in the U.S. do is they put too much emphasis on academic teaching of leadership and not on the development of students as leaders, young people. And, you know, by doing that, they miss the opportunity to prepare our graduates for work in business. And when they do teach them leadership, it saves them those people so much time when they do go into business. They're already partly leading. They don't have to go from zero to a, a sooner thing. Education is an individual performer culture. So we rank students based on their writings, their tests, their grades. We rank our faculty based on their teaching, their research, their performance. That's not a good culture for leader development. A better culture is when students are working together. And one of the things that you'll find in universities in the United States, I think in particular, is that engineering schools often have quality leader development. And the reason is much of engineering teaching and training is in teams. They work in project teams. And that's the perfect set of circumstances for creating leaders who then, when they move into business, they'll be much better. And so I think that has a lot to do with how we can graduate college graduates into business or graduates from trade schools into business and have them be ready to lead, ready to move forward, and not merely, well educated about it, but practiced. I often tell people that it's kind of like learning to play tennis or football. You can talk about it in a classroom all you want, but you won't be better at it until you do it and you have a coach telling you how to do it and how to improve. That's what we need. That's what we need in order to move people forward. And we can save businesses billions of dollars in training if we produce graduates who have already been developed, not just educated, but developed as leaders.
Dr. Thomas, how does emotional intelligence, including resilience and measured optimism, play a role in the effectiveness of leaders confronting extremist situations?
Yeah. Well, I will tell you, they're both very important. Both very important. Um, Resilience gives both the leader and the followers the ability to act when surprises occur, when things that were not planned occur. That's the value of resilience. And of course, every one of my coaching clients is given an emotional intelligence instrument called the EQI 2.0, and it has 15 subscales. And two of those subscales are resilience and optimism. And they're both quite important. Now, optimism is key. And the reason is that when you're in difficult circumstances, uncertain circumstances, you don't have enough rational information for the future to be positive. And so leaders have to be optimistic. They have to keep people focused on a positive future because that's what they want to build. That's what they want to win. And it won't happen naturally in those circumstances. You know, the way you create it is by being optimistic. And one of the things that I found is that there are really three elements or ways of leaders to talk to people about what's happening. So one way is to talk logically and rationally. But that's a disadvantage in circumstances where there's uncertainty because you don't have, sufficient information. You can also try to inspire people emotionally. But the reason that doesn't work is that people become suspicious about it. And when they see a leader who's acting based on emotions, there's an uncertain quality to that they don't trust. But the third way is to talk to them transformationally. And what that means is keep them focused on the future, keep telling them it's positive and bright and you're going to be there. And in speaking that way, you do not have to be rational or emotional. You don't have to tell them the exact way there's going to be success. You just have to tell them it's going to happen. And they are willing to follow a leader who's speaking transformationally like that. We're going to win. We're going to get past this. I'll see you on the other side. In the military, we always have a saying when we're about to go into combat. I'll see you on the objective. That's what we tell soldiers who are with us. We'll see you on the objective. The assumption is we'll make it. We'll make it to the objective. That's transformational communication by focusing them on the future, even if you can't explain how it's going to happen. They want to hear that. That's what they need to hear. And so doing it that way can take you forward in almost any set of dangerous circumstances or just uncertain parts of business where you don't know the future. You don't know what's happening with the stock market. You don't know what's going to happen with a market. Optimism, very important.
Dr. Thomas, you have mentioned that experiencing adversity and even tragedy is part of in extremis leadership. What advice do you have for leaders on coping with loss within their teams?
Very important. Often when I'm speaking to people about in extremis leadership, I'll ask them how many of them have been in an organization that's had a death. Probably 2/3 raise their hand. So it's very common to experience that. And the first thing to remember, the first thing leaders have to remember, all eyes are on them. So people are watching the leader's presence and watching what they're going to do and what they're going to say. You have to focus on the people who are experiencing the loss, the families, the spouses, the children. Don't talk about professional matters. They're unimportant to those people. What happened at work, what happens with professional circumstances, they don't care about that. They're grieving. And so don't talk about professional things. Focus on them. Share grief with them. It's all right for a leader who is perceived as being very strong to have tears in their eyes. That's fine, because that connects you with some of the people who have directly experienced the tragedy. Don't ever show anger. Don't ever show anything related to work, because that will just bring that kind of emotion to people who can't handle it right then. They're grieving. So it is an important trigger for leaders to back away from their professional roles, from their work, under circumstances where the person perhaps shouldn't have died. They have to back away from anger. That's not what grief is about. And they need to be there in ways that are supportive of the grieving people. And remember, everyone is watching. Everyone is trying to interpret who you are as a leader by how you react. And they will always defend your reaction to supporting people who are in grief. But they're not going to appreciate a reaction that brings in the work or the profession or anything like that. That's the wrong time for that.
Dr. Thomas, could you share a case study or example where in extremis leadership transform a group or a team, especially in non-military settings, such as monitoring or emergency response?
Yes, I can. And I think the one that I'd like to share with you is an emergency response example. In 2005, in August of 2005, we had a hurricane hit the southern United States in the state of Louisiana, and it was incredibly destructive in the city of New Orleans. It killed more than 1,300 people. It put flood all throughout the city. And there was a need for a hospital at Tulane University Hospital, to be evacuated because it had no power. The first floor had 6 feet of water in it. It was it had to be evacuated. It was run by a company that still exists called Hospital Corporations of America. And in the US, that's 15 to 20% of the hospitals in the United States. And at that time, they had a CEO named Jack Bovender. And he had always led the people who were his employees in the hospitals to remember that if there's any other concern or any other thing that has to be done, the number one value is for patients. Taking care of patients, the number one value. Nothing else is as important. And so the people in that hospital felt very empowered. They created um, a removal strategy with more than 150 helicopter movements. They created uh, groups of trucks that would go and get supplies and drugs. They would go to a gun store and they would take guns and use them to protect the patients as they were moving through this abysmal, crazy set of circumstances where there was a lot of crime and, a lot of people taking things. And I talked to that CEO about how this was done because there was very little way to communicate. He could only get through a few emails. There was no phone communications available, and that sort of thing. And he explained that he didn't prepare for crisis. He led in a way that's also appropriate for crisis. And what his quote was to me, and I'll really never forget this. He said, and I've got it written down here, you can't change yourself into something in 30 minutes that you haven't been for 30 years. So what he said, and it's very important for people to understand this about in extremis leadership. You have to behave in a way that's supportive like that every day. It's not just a crisis reaction. There's no crisis leadership style. You have to lead in a way that people are empowered to handle crises with no warning, with no orders by you, that they do it naturally and appropriately. And so all of the principles of in extremis leadership should be apparent in business every day. The building of trust, the lack of excessive self-interest. When they were doing this, they were doing many things that could have gotten them serious lawsuits. And what this CEO told me was, he said, I'd rather deal with 10 lawsuits than lose one patient. He he was more than willing to take on big problems in order for the mission to be performed, in order for people to be helped. And there were actually books written about this hospital being evacuated. It was a tremendously successful effort. And that was not true of many other places in New Orleans at the time. So employees were empowered by that leader, by him telling them, patients are more important than the policies I give you. Patients are more important than me. Patients are more important than following management policies. And that put them in a position of being highly successful. And it was not done as a reaction to crisis. It was done every day for years. And so that's really how businesses can benefit, is that if they follow these in extremis leadership principles every day and they treat their people that way, they'll never have to plan for a crisis. A crisis can happen with no warning, and people will be ready. The organization will respond properly with empowerment and action, and they'll be successful in the crisis. And really, they won't have to do a thing. This CEO said that although he tried to communicate, mostly he was just watching his people, just hearing about what they were doing, how they were using the helicopters, where they were taking the patients. He was not ordering people around. You know, success was prepared years before. And that's the best way to get through crisis.
Dr. Thomas, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. What pitfalls should organizations avoid when designing leader development programs, especially when preparing leaders for moments of high stress or crisis?
Um, you know, in the design of development programs, one of the things that we see a lot is what I refer to as leadertainment. There are activities that are entertaining during the development program, but there's no evidence that they actually improve leadership. And, often the people who are responsible for leader development will do this because they want high ratings. They want the people to tell the boss that, oh, it was a good program. We really enjoyed being in that program. But often learning about leader development and becoming a better leader is not necessarily all that fun. It's work. And so I think one of the most important things is to look at what's happening and ask yourself in a critical fashion, is this effective leader development or is this leadertainment? I'll give you an example. Uh, Most universities have, uh, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars that they will pay for leadership speakers. And the same is true of businesses. They will have other CEOs come in and speak, and they will have leadership speakers. When we did our research at Rice University, we found that there was zero leadership improvement caused by leadership speakers. People enjoyed them. People would listen to them. They would talk about things that were relevant. But as soon as people left, within 24 to 48 hours, there was no improvement in how they led or what they did. And yet, the belief is that having those speakers, will help a lot. Another example that we discovered had to do with single session workshops. People would create a workshop in a morning for 90 minutes for 2 hours. They would do something, and a week later, the measurements that we did on the leaders who attended that had not changed. It had not done anything. But we did find out that if you had multi-session workshops, and the best way that we did it at Rice University was we would do a 2-hour workshop followed by 2 weeks of application, where we would challenge the people who were there to take what they had learned and apply it for 2 weeks. And then we would have a second 2-hour workshop that that would basically be an accountability drill. It would make sure that they did apply that. That changed people. That created a change in leadership. But most of the time, the workshops are single session, they happen in a day or a morning, and then that's it. And those things do not prepare leaders for high stress or crisis or really improve their leadership in any way. Um, I do think it's also important for people to see that others who led in crisis or serious circumstances were eventually recognized and rewarded for that. Because often people will stop what they're doing and do nothing during a crisis because they're afraid that if they do something, they'll be, held accountable for it, or that, it won't be seen as positive. And so I think they need to be shown that it can be very positive to to work hard during a crisis and to work for other people, not just yourself. A crisis is when you should have the least concern for yourself and the most concern for others. And if you can show people that's been rewarded, that will help them. That will help them be willing to move and to take action when otherwise they would just stop and do nothing and wait for someone to tell them what to do.
Listeners, we hope this conversation on In Extremis Leadership with Dr. Thomas Kolditz provided valuable insights into leading with courage and competence, especially when the stakes are high. Thank you for joining us today. We are grateful to Dr. Thomas for joining us today and sharing insights from his book, In Extremis Leadership. Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas.
Well, it's my pleasure, and you've done a terrific job, I think, uh, talking to me through this and asking, what I think were all very intelligent and useful questions. So it was good for me too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.